what are we here? 900 plus episodes. And just like you guys, I've learned a tremendous amount from my co-host Cage. But one of the things that I've learned from just a buyer standpoint is, and he's imparted this into you guys quite a bit as well. He said, we have eBay, we have gold, we have PWC, sort of the new age of collecting. But he always talked to you guys about the amazing deals and opportunities when it came to legacy auction houses. Auction houses have been around for a very long time. And, it's funny. I looked at Robert Edward auctions, and it even still says baseball cards. And that talks a little bit about the tradition, the legacy of this beautiful industry that we all love. And it's evolving in front of our eyes. But I got really, really lucky. We met a gentleman named Joe Drelich. He runs a show out of Philly and Chantilly. He's been doing it for quite some time. He's one of the kindest people I've met in the hobby. And he's been running these shows for a long time. He said, Andrew, I'm a listener of your show. Here are a few people you haven't had on as guests that I'd highly recommend. And towards the top of that list was Brian Dwyer. He's CEO of Robert Edward Auctions, and he's joining us today. One, obviously, I'm going to ask the origin story, but I also want to hear from his perspective kind of what the hobby has in store as we're changing the tide, from this Panini to Fanatics era and so on. So, Brian, without further ado, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a long-time listener myself, so good to be in the chair with you guys.
And that art behind you, you want to give a quick shout-out? Because it's gorgeous. It's the 1952 mantle painting.
Yeah, so it's done by an artist named John Post. So he's someone that I met probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And he did a series of original paintings based off classic vintage cards. So he did 52 Mantle, he did 52 Robinson, Gowdy Gehrig, Leaf Ruth. And I fell in love with it. He gave them to us for auction. They went to private collectors. And then I had the opportunity to buy them from those collectors. And I jumped at them. I mean, I look at them every day and I absolutely adore them.
So I'm going to jump in here. Andrew does all kinds of intros. He does all kind of great stuff. And I want to, implore the listeners, the thousands of people who listen and the millions at home around the world, wrestling fans. This is not just an episode, right? I mean, you hear this is, Brian Dwyer from Robert Edward Auctions. We're not going to be talking about, what's coming up for auction. We're not going to be doing that. This episode, if Brian allows us to kind of delve into his past, his history with the hobby, will have something for everyone. If you're an entrepreneur, Brian can tell you about his entrepreneurial spirit. If you like auction houses and you like, the inner workings of it and everything from setting up an auction to going on CBS to promote your auction, he's going to have that for you. He's going to talk about behind the scenes at a grading company, and we can talk about his time working at SGC. He can talk to you about the ebbs and flows of the hobby, which for someone like me, I can tell you, but I got Cage, that's an old man. He's telling you about what the hobby was like 20, 30, 40 years ago. But Brian will be able to tell you about what the hobby was like in the early 2000s, what it was like starting the eBay consignment business back then. So many people are doing it now during this wave. And waves come and they go. And Brian starts businesses. He started a couple of them. We'll get through all of them. Andrew will ultimately ask your origin story and we'll go from there. But I promise you guys, if you give this one a chance, Brian's story, it's funny because it's unique to him because it has so many great little turns. But I hope you forgive me for saying this. It's not unique to the hobby because there are so many cool stories like this in the hobby that someone has turned a childhood passion into a career, but a career that has zigged and zagged, a career that has taken you to the different things that the hobby has to offer. So I'm really excited about this episode. And guys, please, Brian's a great guest. I can't wait to chat about, and I'm curious to see which way Andrew takes us. So without further ado, go ahead, Andrew. Ask him.
Was there a question or was that?
No.
Cage
that's
does
my
this
intro.
thing.
That's my intro. As an intro. That my intro to the episode is this guy. If you want to talk to him about starting a business and then selling it, and that business still running today under the owners he sold it to, he can talk to you about that. You want to talk to you about going to trade shows, representing SGC at different shows? He can talk to you about that. Want to talk about an auction house? Talk to you about that. Talk about original eBay consignment businesses that so many people are building up now? About that. You want to start with the origin story and go from there?
Did you have lemonade stands when you were growing up? Yes or no?
I never had a lemonade stand, no. But I raked a lot of leaves. I shoveled a lot of snow.
Come on, man. Where are you originally from?
I'm from upstate New York, a town called Poughkeepsie.
Nice. Okay.
Glad you
I know
called
Poughkeepsie from the Friends episode.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
See, anything north of the Bronx, I consider upstate also. So I'm glad that Poughkeepsie is. A lot of people from Poughkeepsie be like, "You're from out in Long Island. You're further away from Manhattan and the city than I am. I'm not upstate. You're in the ocean."
Well, so now I live and I work in New Jersey, and so I learned really quick that if I'm outside the 5 boroughs, I might as well be Canada. So,
That's right. That's right. You're in Buffalo.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 6 hours from the Canadian border, but a lot of people consider me true upstate. So
love it.
So before I ask you the origin story, Cage called me last night and we had a fun little debate. What is easier to run, an auction house or a grading company?
I mean, they both present a tremendous amount of challenges. I think that the grading companies, everybody's second guessing you, right? So I would say that the grading companies have, and I've worked at a grading company like Cage alluded to, I think the grading companies probably have more detractors than the auction houses, but they both got a lot of challenges.
Okay. So grew up, rake leaves, shoveled snow. When did you find cards? For me, it was my grandma, save up a little bit of money. We'd go to flea markets. I'd buy Terrell Davis and Brett Favre cards. Still doesn't make any sense. We got to sit down with Terrell Davis for a minute. What was your origin story?
Yeah, 6 years old. For some reason, my parents decided that was the perfect age to buy me my first set of Topps baseball cards. So here I am, 1992. I get this nice, shiny blue box with 792 cards in it. And I lock myself in my room for 2-3 days, sorting them by player, by team, looking at the stats. I mean, I just became enamored. And my parents, I think a light bulb went off in their head where I was like, all right, this is a go-to gift now for Christmas and birthdays and special occasions. And so that was really my first exposure to the idea of a baseball card. I didn't find vintage until I was about 11 or 12. And my grandmother, like your grandmother, loved a good garage sale and loved a good turn a nickel into $5. And
yeah.
So she started buying me some cards from the 60s and 70s that she would come across. And that was really what got the wheel spinning about maybe vintage is cooler than modern for me.
What is vintage? Because I keep hearing this word vintage, but like vintage has to change, right? Like vintage for my generation and vintage for some of the kids that came into the hobby in 2012, 15, 17. Is Jordan 86 Fleer going to be vintage, or is vintage more the scarcity and the supply that's available in the market?
So I think the hobby has always used timelines as defining, right? So, I mean, for us, we consider vintage pre-1970. I think a lot of people would disagree with that, right? 1970 Topps is now already 50 plus years old. And you could argue, to your point, that there are people in the hobby today that think the 90s is vintage. We certainly get emails to that effect on a weekly basis where they say, I've got old baseball cards. I've had them for 35 years. Okay. Doesn't make them valuable, doesn't make them truly vintage. So, from where we sit, we consider vintage pre-1970, but you're not wrong if you talk about the 80s being vintage necessarily.
It's funny because that vintage term, it came out, I believe with the, with the rise in grading companies, third-party grading, because they had to delineate, okay, it's a modern, now you have ultra modern. And it's funny because, 1971 was sort of like that bright line demarcation. And I use like 2010, like in that range as to, exactly when like people needed to have that bright line demarcation. And if you ask an antique dealer, what they'll tell you, vintage, I mean, the term vintage is of age, right? It's got the word age in it, Andrew. But most antique dealers will tell you 40 years. If something is 40 years or more, it's of age, it's vintage. And it's funny because that 70, it hasn't changed. I would expect, and I could be wrong here, but I would expect at some point in time, maybe if I'm running a third-party grading company, that vintage, maybe in the next couple of years, moves from 71 to 81. Because I think 81 is still vintage, but,
Well, another interesting take. When I worked at SGC, we delineated vintages pre-1972. And it was described to me as 1973 was the first year that cards were available for purchase as a set. And so that was the dawn of the modern hobby. So, I mean, everybody's got a different
one. Yeah, that's good. I like it.
But that was in 2007 when I went to work for SGC and I got my crash course on the hobby. That was one of the rationales that was told to me.
Break that down. So 1973 was the beginning of the modern hobby because you could buy cards as a set. How were they sold before, and what does that mean?
So prior to that, they were sold in series. And so the manufacturers, I mean, mostly Topps at that time, was issuing wax packs by series in somewhat of a staggered fashion. So if you were looking to build a 1969 top set, you might only get the first 132 cards in April or May. You might get the second batch in May or June. You might get the third batch in June and July. And so, some of these sets 1972 had 7 series worth of cards that were dropped. So it was just a way to keep interest and activity going throughout this long baseball season. And then come fall, they would just drop the entire football set in one fell swoop. So
same design, staggered release versus like now what Panini does, National Treasures, then Prism, then
no. So there wasn't those are different sets. You've jumped from advanced. You've jumped from beginner to advanced. Go intermediary. Think of what Topps does now. Topps does a flagship. That's Series 1. They have a Series 2 release. Think of like 2019 if you want to, because I know you were collecting stuff there. There's a 2019 Topps regular flagship, and then there's the Series 2 had Tatis in it, right? And then there's the update. So the top set, if you bought a complete top set for the year, don't get into like Chrome and Chrome Chronic, whatever the hell brands Topps has now. I don't even know. There's so many stupid things that they're releasing, but the top set does come in different releases, right? That previously was, Topps and like an update or a traded set was the only little additional thing they did. So you're right, Andrew. It's expanded, but it used to just be you got packs. And people were putting the set together, and the chase was, and Brian, tell me if I'm wrong here. You were keeping kids. All right, during the season. All right, well, I already completed that 100 card, release, or 150, 200 card release. Well, let's send out some new ones.
Yeah.
And the kids are building the set. In 73, you could buy in a box the whole set. You didn't have to collect it. It became like a Hess truck. Give it to a kid for Christmas, the complete set.
You'd see a 74 top set in the Sears catalog.
See?
Who was your favorite player growing up?
Cal Ripken.
Cal Ripken.
Yeah.
People tell me he's not very liked. He's very. What is the deal with that?
Did you just say skeeved? Is that what did you just use?
Not very well liked.
I don't know. I've met him. I've had the pleasure of meeting him twice. I have nothing but good things to say about my interactions with him. But for me, growing up, I just admired his work ethic. Here I am in the heart of Yankee country, and I'm a Cal Ripken fan. It made no sense. I can't even describe the origin story of my Cal Ripken affinity, but
why did he raise such a troublemaker to put F face on?
That's Billy Ripken. That's not his son.
That's not his son?
That's his brother.
Cal Ripken's rookie is 1982. Billy Ripken card is 1989. What did he have him when he was 4? I mean, like, what do you
I didn't do the math.
Was his son?
I didn't.
I'll tell you this: you're not that far off. Cal Ripken, that we're talking about, Jr., is the son of Cal Ripken Sr. Maybe that's what you were thinking about. Who also
it's like the Kennedys of baseball. The Kennedys. All right, so let's fast forward to 2007. I was graduating.
Andrew, you should love Cal Ripken too, because you're an Iron Man of podcasts, right? Every single day you show up and you do a podcast. That was Ripken. You had to respect the dude, right? You had to respect him. Showed up every day and played.
I did, but now we've gone to a few shows. I've met some handlers, and I've heard some things. So I was asking. I'm normally wrong. So
by the way, ignore all that. What he was told was Billy Ripken is me. He just has his Ripkins all screwed.
So 2007, I'm graduating high school. You went to work for SGC. Why? Why go into the business of the hobby when you're probably enjoying flipping cards?
You skipped.
I skipped a big part.
Skipped a lot.
Well, Brian could connect the dots.
Yeah, I signed up for eBay in 1998, so I was 12 years. And I signed up under the watchful eye of my dad. But I was buying and selling on eBay from 1998 until 2007 when I was going to work for SGC, and I just loved the idea that here I am in Poughkeepsie, New York, and I'm buying cards from a guy in California, or I'm selling cards to a guy in Texas, and I remember trying to complete my 1970 Top Story booklet set, and I couldn't find it at the White Plains show, but I found it on eBay. And that was just an awesome concept to me, and I fell in love with the idea that I could meet other collectors, and the internet was in its, not truly its infancy, but the hobby message boards were starting, and PSA rolled out message boards in the late 90s. And so I got to meet a lot of people and buy and sell on eBay. I started selling for people on eBay. I started selling my best friend's dad's childhood collection on eBay. And I just got exposed to all these different areas of the hobby at a very young age that I went to school. I went to college in New Jersey. In 2007, I needed extra credits, and I got an independent study approved for an internship at SGC. So their offices were 15 minutes from my university. And
Rutgers.
Seton Hall.
Seton Hall. Nice. That's cool.
Better dead than red. So
Wow.
I had gotten introduced to the CEO of SGC at the time. And I said, look, I need college credit. You don't have to pay me. I'd love to just get in, and I love cards and I want to learn and be exposed. And so I did an unpaid internship at SGC. And that was really what my springboard to where I am today was.
If you guys don't know, what I thought was kind of cool with SGC in like the early 2000s, they were doing encased. They did encased before encased was the thing.
Yeah.
Was this around the time 2000, 2001 when you got the internship, or was it a little bit later in the 2000s?
So my internship was in 2007, but there were still people there. I mean, there are still people there today that were working on those products. There was a product called UD Graded at the time where Upper Deck, to my understanding, would ship the cards to SGC. They'd be graded and then inserted into packs or boxes. So yeah, it was a very interesting, revolutionary concept at that time.
And grading wasn't the way I understood it, right? I mean, Beckett was sort of like kind of the pioneer of modern grading, and PSA has recently kind of come in and taken that and ran with it. And SGC is doing amazing things now as well. And we see new grading companies popping up. But back then, grading wasn't as prevalent as it is now.
No, not at all. I mean, I used to do over 20 trade shows a year for SGC, and a lot of my shtick was trying to sell people on the idea of grading. And I remember doing the Toronto Expo, and people would look at me like I had 15 heads. Like, why do I need somebody to tell me what the condition of my cards are? Why do I need to pay extra money? I already bought the card. So it was
just a fancy Zoom.
Yeah.
The metaverse is garbage. There's no need for it at all. It's just a fancy Zoom.
I'm
telling you, dude. Brian's 100% right. Nobody wants. I'm better than you. Who are you? Who are these people? Who's going to be telling me what my card is? I know what an excellent mint is. I know what a near mint is. I know what I put it right on my table. I didn't need to pay money and send it to somebody else.
Let's role play. How would you handle that objection?
So for us, I mean, I would tell people that it was the easiest way to protect your items first and foremost. And then if you ever did want to sell, it was the easiest way to eliminate any ambiguity or uncertainty or disagreement about the condition, right? Because here you have an industry accepted third party, and it allowed me to sit in Poughkeepsie, New York and buy a card confidently from someone in California because I knew that we were speaking the same language. So I sold it as insurance and protection if you intended to keep your cards, and I sold it as ease of transfer and make a quicker, more confident sale, realize more money if you were in it for selling.
Yeah, but if I send you a bunch and the guy next to me doesn't send as many, you're going to give me better grades, right?
I mean, that was another thing that we had to ask and answer all the time. Why?
I know I was there listening to this.
How do you know? How do I know I'm going to get the same cards back? How do I know that I'm not going to get worse grades than my buddy who sends 1,000 cards? I mean, it was such a wild concept that the conspiracy theories ran wild.
And I can't touch my cardboard anymore. Why would I want to hermetically seal my collection? What's wrong with people? Why would they do this? I touch the cardboard. It's a card. It's supposed to be held. Seriously, Andrew. Now it's like people don't want to. They don't want to see their cards. Not only is it hermetically sealed, you don't even touch it. It's in a vault somewhere, and you buy and sell it, and no one even knows. It's crazy. The hobby has come a long way, and I'm sure we'll look back 15 years and be like, I can't believe the way we were doing it 15 years ago.
So now when you see, let's use tag grading, for example, right? They're using computer vision and they give you like a report. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I think that a company like Tag is facing the same challenges that SGC was facing 15 years ago, right? They're trying to revolutionize a hobby. They're trying to make significant changes to a hobby, and people don't know what to think of it. So, I think I always fall into the more information is better camp. I like having an idea of why my card graded a certain way because, we know as collectors, not all 9s are created equal. Not all threes are created equal. You're going to have way more variation at the lower end of the scale than the higher end of the scale. And so knowing that, hey, there's a hidden wrinkle or a crease, or there's glue residue, or, you know, all these things, I mean, I think is valuable. So, you know, we'll see if they can crack the hobby like we tried to do 15 years ago.
Just don't crack the case.
Exactly.
So, okay. So let's fast forward. So 2007, intern at SGC. I do want to ask you sort of about, you know, kind of how you viewed or looked at this kind of previous run up for 2020 to now, and also what you think going forward. But was there anything defining for you as a hobby businessman from 2007 to right before the COVID and that boom that happened?
So 2008 was the defining year of my life, you could argue, because I graduated in May of 2008 with a degree in finance at the height of this global recession. And so here I was 6 months earlier thinking I was going to go be an investment banker, and all the job offers, all my friends had their offers rescinded. Bear Stearns ceased to exist from my fall semester to my spring semester. Lehman Brothers was on its way out. So I had to make this quick pivot as to, well, what am I going to do in a terrible job market? And what are my passions, and where can I make some money? And so I was already in at SGC. And I said, I love cards. You could use the extra help. Would you consider hiring me full time? And so I kind of viewed it as maybe just a way to ride out this uncertain economy. But I knew I loved it. I knew I was passionate about it. I knew I had been doing it on my own, buying and selling for, you know, almost a decade at that point. And I said, I wouldn't resist this if it turned into something more. And here we are, you know, going on 16 years later. This is my full-time job.
Mind if I kind of probe here? Because if we look back just to the last 3-6 months, I think a little bit of similar patterns are playing out, more in anticipation than actually. So I've just been watching auction supply numbers. And if you look at the last 3 months, people, I do feel there was a bit of a shock to people, and a lot of liquidation happened, right? And I don't think that the unemployment, the business collapses have sort of been priced in or happened yet. But you are seeing, you know, Amazon cutting 10,000 jobs, Coinbase cutting jobs, all these companies cutting jobs. The general thesis is that during a recession, or when times are bad, like 2008, that the hobby would suffer. But here's SGC was actually hiring you full time. So you guys didn't feel the effects of the recession?
No, so it's interesting because, you know, people ask me even today, what do you think about your business going into economic uncertainty? And I always tell people I'm not a mortician, so I hesitate to say that my business is recession proof. But if you think about it, when the economy is doing really well, there's this buying frenzy and people are flush with cash. When the economy is not doing well, people are flocking to liquidate. And so maybe that involves getting their cards graded. Maybe that involves bringing their cards to auction. So there's this, and then there's always a part of the population that's unaffected, good, bad, or indifferent in the economy. Right. So there's this element to hobby businesses like auction houses and grading companies that's really got a steady flow, kind of regardless of what's going on a larger level.
Okay. Love the answer. I mean, it
defies logic.
No, not really. I mean, look, as long as you buy into the fact that liquidation of people's accounts, you know, or liquidation of people's, you know, collections, it's not a great thing for the hobby. We'd all rather it be the other side of the coin, where everybody is making more money and everybody's buying more cards. And, you know, every auction house is flush with auctions and cards because people are buying and prices are going up. But I guess what he's saying there is, and it makes total sense, I'll give a comparison to another industry, but it makes total sense because, you know, the other side of the equation is people get in, they run up. There are people who are going to lose money, and you're almost the house, right? But you're the house of a poker game, right? So people playing poker, you're just taking a rake. There are going to be winners at the table. There's going to be losers at the table. At the time when the market's going up, there's more winners. At the time when the market's going down, people might be losing money, but auction houses, hobby businesses are usually still taking a rake to allow them that liquidity, which is fine. But Andrew, somebody told me this about workers' compensation once, that when the market's great, people are working and people are hiring and people are getting more jobs, that the workers' compensation industry is great, and all workers' comp lawyers and carriers, they all do well because there's more people working, so there's more people getting hurt, so there's more work for them as workers' comp lawyers. when the market's bad and people are getting laid off and there's not as much stuff being built and as many jobs, well, the underbelly comes out and people pretend to have injuries because they don't want to get fired. And the workers' comp industry booms again. It's the same kind of thing. Like it just depends on how you want to look at the coin. And I think Brian, he's explained it pretty well. There are certain things. It's not a funeral home, but depending upon which side of the cycle, people who are involved in both sides will need an auction house to sell their cards or to buy cards from. So I love it.
So Brian, when did you move from SGC to Robert Edward?
So there was a stop in between.
Here's the one you're going to like, Andrew, the entrepreneurial story.
Cage set it up perfectly. This is a journey that took a lot of twists and turns, but thankfully all upward. I left SGC in 2010. And so I had been there for 2.5 years, and I really missed the buying and selling. That's where I cut my teeth. That's what I really drew me into jumping into the hobby with both feet. And when you work for a third-party grading company, you're not able to buy and trade as freely as you would if you weren't affiliated with them. So I left in 2010, and I left shortly after the National that year. And I said, what am I going to do? What's my next step? How can I take this buying and selling? I love the hobby. I think I'm good at it. I think I've got a lot of good relationships. How can I parlay this into something? And so in 2010, I set out to start my own auction house, because at that point in time, there was no in between from the high-end auction houses of the world and DIY on eBay. So I set out to offer kind of an auction house experience for lower to middle value cards. And in February of 2011, I ran my first auction, a company called Sterling Sports Auctions, which, as Cage said, still operates to this day after I sold it.
I still bid there.
Great. Lee at Sterling does a tremendous job. I handpicked him from a number of people that were interested in the company when I announced that it was for sale. But, I was putting out 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 card auctions, mostly graded cards. And we were serving a need that didn't exist. The eBay consigners were not what they are today. The auction house landscape was not as crowded as it is today. And so I really consider Sterling to be the first company to offer that experience for guys that had $50 cards or $500 cards, because the other auction houses that were operating at that time, they didn't want to talk to you unless you had $1,000 cards or $5,000 cards or $50,000 cards. So I did that for about a year and a couple months until I caught the attention of the Robert at Robert Edward Auctions. And he said, hey, you've got a good thing going. People like
stealing my market share, he said.
Well, to be honest with you, we played in completely different sandboxes. But what he appreciated for me was my connections. I was able to fill out these auctions month in and month out based on people that I knew and reputation and relationships that I had cultivated. And I fit his mantra, service, honesty, integrity, transparency. I was operating in very similar fashion to how he was operating his much larger auction company. And so I sold Sterling in 2012, and I went to work for Robert Edwards. And it was June of that year, and we were doing one auction a year as a company at REA. And one of the conditions of my employment was branching out to 2 auctions, which seems foreign now that we're doing 11 auctions a year. But so that was how I ended up at REA. It was June of 2012.
So he convinced you, entrepreneur, Sterling's crushing it, to come join our one auction a year. Robert, this guy's a good salesperson.
Well, so again, it's hard to maybe look back with your 2012 glasses on, but I tell people, it was like I was playing minor league baseball and I was doing fine and I was a solid hitter and I'm starting day in and day out. But then the Yankees call me and they say, hey, we're playing the Red Sox and we need a center fielder. Okay. And so that was reputationally and position in the industry and the type of material that they were handling for a card fanatic like me, going to a company that was selling a Honus Wagner every auction and a Baltimore News Ruth every auction and Mickey Mantle jerseys. I just couldn't turn it down. So yes, I was doing well, but I saw the writing on the wall as to the potential at REA. And once he told me that he was open to expanding, I said, I'm game and I want to be that guy.
Big fish, small pond, medium fish, and an ever-growing pond. Let's go. I'm going to be the Mickey Mantle of the hobby, basically center fielder for the Yankees. I'm not going to ask you if you have a Mickey Mantle bleacher story. That's for another day.
The family.
You've never seen that?
Oh, he knows. He said it's a family show. He knows exactly what you're talking about.
It's a family show, except for on Tuesdays. And this gives a lot of hope, because what I've seen recently is accounts on Instagram pop up and saying, hey, you don't have to necessarily go to any of these huge auction houses. If you want the care and the service of your, $1,000 to $10,000 cards or $1,000 to $20,000 cards consigned, I'm opening up a consignment business on eBay. I'm going to give it all the time, care. And I think it gives hope. I'm thinking Jocko Sports, San Diego Sports is another one. As they're starting up, it gives you hope to see, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There are steps to take. So, okay. So you went to Robert Edward. Did you, I obviously enjoyed
Before we
your time.
leave this time period, this 07 to 2012, right? Brian can give a unique, I don't want you to go into details, Brian, but he can give a unique perspective to some people who have gotten in the hobby in the last couple of years and have seen a boom and bust, seen the rise of the hanky-panky content, and has now seen lawsuit 2023, lawsuits all over the place. In 09, the FBI was at the National. There were indictments, right? So they were buying a flight from Mr. Mastro. There was hanky panky and there was craziness in the hobby too. Brian, did the hobby get through it?
The hobby got through it, and the hobby's thriving. And and if you talk to people that were in the hobby in the 70s, they'll tell you of standing at trade shows in Detroit where the guy who consigned his card to the card show auction had his son bidding on it from the back of the room. As long as there's money involved, you go back to, BC, I'm sure there's been elements of fraud. But the important thing is that those bad actors get weeded out. The hobby understands that people are looking at it, and maybe it's not regulated in the sense like, the SEC regulates stocks, but there are eyes on the industry. And
he means BC like BC in like a long time ago. BC in the hobby is before Card Ladder.
I was going to say before. So but look, the hobby got through it, and if you talk about 2012, REA was doing one auction a year. That auction would consistently do between $9 and $10 million. It was the biggest event in the industry.
Yep.
And now you've got Wagner's selling for $6-7 million. You've got 52 Mantle selling for $12 million. You could have bought the entire REA auction in 2012, ended up with a Ruth rookie in a 6, a Wagner in a 3, a Baltimore News Ruth in a 1. It's really the escalation in prices, escalation in material. It's been kind of awesome to watch.
It feels like you guys just like every year it's a Super Bowl game for you guys. Like I would probably get the just insane butterflies like the 24 hours before an auction ended. Because it's like we've been working our whole year for this, and then it's like we don't know what's going to happen, right? It's incredible. But anyway,
people like it. You hope people show up.
We're gonna come back to the Ruth Baltimore News because PWCC did this amazing thing. It was like the top 75 most iconic, and now it's fun because you get to actually see what iconic cards are. I'm gonna ask you your 5 most iconic cards, okay?
And your 5 top NBA players and whether Kobe's in it. I'm just kidding. Don't answer that. It's been a week.
Is Kobe in your top 5? Yes or no? True or false?
I think he's in the top 5.
Okay.
Oh, people are gonna love
Smart.
you. And
it's fascinating the engagement that got. But okay, so let's fast forward. 2020. How do you process this COVID run up? How do you process what happened in the last 2 years in terms of prices going ballistic and now coming back to Earth, and we're not sure where Earth is?
Yeah, so in 2020, I remember distinctly having an all hands on deck conference call because the office was shut down and it was going to be 2 weeks. And so I have a conference call for my staff and we say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And that was about March 13th. We were scheduled to start an auction 3 weeks later. And we were going to be the first auction out of the gate post-COVID. And so I had the decision to make. I was getting bombarded with phone calls and emails from consigners. pull my items, cancel the auction, move the auction. And we made the very, very tough decision to proceed with the auction as planned. And that auction was an absolute blockbuster. I mean, prices, that was the auction in which a Jordan PSA 10 set a record at like $60,000, which was unheard of at the time. And Last Dance.
Play that back, Luca Nation. You heard that right. That wasn't a misquote. $60,000 right after COVID, first off.
And it was a record. And it was like, wow, that's all for what? You know?
Yeah. The guy had bought it from us previously for $21,000, $22,000. So, that auction, that April of 2020, gave us extreme confidence that, okay, the hobby's resilient and we're gonna make it through this. And then the hobby just was on a rocket ship. And so we, just for context, had 8 employees in March of 2020, and now we have 23 employees. We were doing 3 auctions a year. Now we're doing 10, 11 auctions a year. We were processing, 8,000 items a year. Now we're processing 50,000 items a year. So it's been awesome to watch and to be a part of. And you talk about prices being up and down and coming back to earth. A unique thing about us in the last 2 or 3 years, I think, is that we're vintage, just to go back to that term, pre-1970. That's our niche and that's our specialty. And that's been an area of the hobby that absolutely rode the rocket ship up, but has been much slower, if at all, to take the elevator down. And so that's been exciting for us. That gives us a lot of hope for the hobby moving forward and our role in it. Because, Babe Ruth's always going to be Babe Ruth. They're not making more of them. There's no manufactured scarcity. So it's been a wild couple of years.
What's the deal with the appeal for this Baltimore News Ruth? Why do people like that card?
There's only about 10 of them known to exist. It is Babe Ruth as a minor leaguer in 1914. And so you will have people that argue both sides of the coin. You will have people that say it's Babe Ruth, the earliest card, whatever it is going to be desirable. And then you have other people that say, I'm writing it off because it's a minor league card. But I think it's a card that has a lot of mystique about it. Of the 10 that are known, that population was diminished when a card was accidentally thrown out. That population was diminished when one went into a museum. And we haven't seen one come up for auction in many years. They used to sell pretty frequently, and then they've dried up. So I think it's got a lot of lore and mystique about it, and when it's Babe Ruth, it's worth discussing.
If
I don't like it. I mean, it's funny. My favorite Ruth comes from 20 years after the fact.
Yeah,
so
it's not for everybody,
weird, right?
without a doubt. I think it's super cool. I think it's fascinating that in 1914, this guy who was going to go down as maybe the greatest baseball player of all time had a card made and a schedule on it, and they made different variations of it. I mean, there's 3 different varieties of that Baltimore News Ruth card. So, we talk about the chase of modern cards. It's like, here we are in 1914. They're issuing a blue, a red, a schedule variation. I mean, I just think it's got a lot of cool, interesting things going for it.
So something, and Cage, I apologize, I'm sort of monopolizing, but I'm interested. I do see a little kindred spirit in Brian. And I mean, I graduated college in 2013. So, I mean, 4 years, I think 4 or 5 years older. What if someone came to you, during this run up, Pele rookies have been pretty popular, but there's the question of which is this true rookie. And I'm curious to hear your take, and if you do soccer, but what if someone came to you and said, what is one overrated set or player for vintage, and what is one underrated set or player in the vintage space?
That's a tough one. I think Jackie Robinson was worthy of all the attention that he's now getting. I mean, he was so underrated in the card world for such a long time. So I'm happy to see that the market and the hobby has caught up on that. Wow, that is really
Cage, I'm coming to you next, so don't think I'm going to let you out of the cage match that easy.
Jackie has swung to overrated or overpriced. I mean, the change in Jackie's prices from where he was to where he is now, it's an amazing swing how much the stuff has gone up, especially because the scarcity. I mean, like, I now see a 48 leaf Jackie at almost every show. A couple of them at shows. It's weird.
You know, Koufax is a guy that comes to mind as maybe a little underrated. So he had a short career in the big scheme of things, but just dominant. You know, his rookie obviously gets it's just due, but I think that he's got some cards from the late 50s and 60s that are still not terribly expensive in the big scheme of things. So Koufax is a guy that I would maybe consider to be a little underrated, undervalued. I'll have to come back on that. I'm blanking right now.
Cage?
Well, I mean, he's an auction house. He's not supposed to say anything is overvalued. He's not supposed to say anything is overhyped. I mean, come on, he's supposed to be a hype man. It is what's supposed to happen. Cage. So I mean, you tee me up for haters, but I've been saying it all along. And it's funny because my answer will be guided by sort of what Brian talked about, not just as an auction house, but also just in talking about Jackie Robinson, right? We've seen waves. We've seen rises in price. We've seen things kind of change. We've seen things happen. If he's frozen, that's a great freeze. That's a very photogenic
isn't
smile
it?
right there. That's a great. Like someone should take a screenshot of that. It's fantastic. I wish I could smile like that, right? So look how I make people happy. It's great, right? So he's back.
Sorry about that. We're having a storm out here.
Yeah, it's raining. So,
sorry about it. You should have seen that should be your headshot.
You froze with the greatest smile ever. I'm envious of the smile that you had on, man.
By the way, whoever you have, PJ, shout out to PJ. He is thorough on your team. I just wanted to give him a shout out.
He's an old college friend of mine, believe it or not. I met PJ at Seton Hall, and we took different paths in 2008. But he's probably one of the most diehard sports fans I know. And we reconnected last summer, and now he's working for me, and it's been really good to have him back.
When I was in high school, the pride of Seton Hall was a guy named Luther Wright. Came out in the 1992 draft. He had a decent tournament and made a first-round pick, and I don't think he played more than like 7 minutes in the NBA. He was a big dude. Big dude, Luther Wright. Anyway, so so overrated. I'll say this a million times, and Brian can't say anything's overrated, but I'll say it a million times. The thing I would be more careful with, and it's great that he talked about like Jackie's run up, are things that don't have any type of real history, but have had that significant run up. And if you play back a little bit of this episode, there's some great tidbits from Brian all over this. But they play in a very unique space for the auction house. And I'm a big fan of REA because when you know what your bailiwick is, when you know what your cornerstone is, and you don't deviate too far from it, and you become the best at just this thing, I think there's real value there, right? And you guys are vintage. You do vintage cards. You do mostly vintage baseball cards. You have vintage cards, right? You're not putting out, the shiniest of shiny cards. You're more of an auction house for me, and then don't have a lot of the shinies. Maybe that changes one day. Maybe you add in another segment. Maybe you try one auction here and there. But I use that in how I determine whether something is overpriced, overvalued, overhyped. The reason why, as Brian said, vintage took that elevator or that escalator ride up, but hasn't taken that free fall drop back down, vintage baseball specifically, is because it has a history. There is a sales record. There are, people who have collected it for decades that what the run. So, it probably didn't have the same 20x. It had a nice rise, but it didn't go like this. And it's also not going to do one of these things. So when answering the question about what's overrated, I would stay clear of myself. And I may miss some outsized gains the next huge run up because of this, but I'm okay with that. I stay away from what I like to call the fringe sports that don't have a collector base for a long period of time, that just saw their first comeuppance in this recent boom cycle that we have. And yeah, that includes Pele. I told you, I paid $1,000 for my Pele Alifa Balogun. $1,000. PSA 2s are selling for $25,000 now. That's insane.
Brian, when you have your conversations with people, how are they thinking about soccer, and specifically soccer collecting and Pele, Garrincha, Maradona, Cruyff, the area that you play in? And to just be truthful and honest, because, a lot of people, we have an amazing content team now that takes our episodes and cuts it into clips. And now they're saying, hey, Cage, stop being a clickbaiter. Stop giving us hot takes. And I said, you guys are so dumb. We've been doing this for 900 episodes. Just because you see it on Instagram now, it's hot take. We've been saying this.
These are not hot takes. I believe everything I say.
It's a debate show. But I'm curious, Brian, and I know you're dealing with the storm, so I appreciate you joining and doing what we can. The first 45, there was no glitch, so our audience is not going to have any issue.
All good.
Thoughts on soccer?
So, soccer, we had two or three Pele jerseys in our last auction, and they were signed by Pele, and they garnered incredible interest. And so I understand something like that, because here's shirts that the guy wore on his back, and I think game used memorabilia is an area that of the hobby that could really take off. One of the things that people say to me frequently is, "Oh, soccer's got to be a huge potential market because there's billions of people around the world that play it and watch it." I get that, but like Cage was just saying, there's not that established history there. And so I've been, especially over the last 3 years, cautioning people about irrational exuberance. So don't get caught up in things that don't make sense or don't have established values. That's why I love the arena that we play in. That's why we've built our business on Ruths and Aarons and Cobbs and Wagners and guys like that, because they're established and we can feel very good about selling what we're selling. Pele, Mount Rushmore, potentially of all athletes. I think that he's a guy that deserves to be collected and collected at a high level. But to Cage's point, I think his card prices have just gone off in a manner that it's tough to make sense of. So I preach caution, like Cage was just saying. I preach buying what you like and being okay if it all goes to zero. But we have not delved into soccer deeply for probably a lot of the same reasons you guys have talked about.
Brian may like this. Underrated. Type 1 photos. They sell some nice ones. They sell some Type 1s. I've been on, he's got some Jordans. But Satchel Paige will be my underrated for a lot of reasons. The historical reasons, but also because he only really got to play at the, I don't want to call it tail end, but the real tail end. Some say he was pitching at like 50 years old at the end there. So there's not a lot of cards for him. I mean, you got the 48 Leaf, which is a short print to death. Yep. I love his 53 Tops, which is kind of like an art card for him. It's like drawing card. You've seen the 53 Tops mantle, obviously, Andrew, which is a really, nice card. There's just not a lot of Satchel Paige cards to choose from. And I think, his historical significance and the fact that people say how great he was, that's just one guy,
Wasn't he like 50 years old when pitching?
He was pitching to a ripe old age.
Brian, I want to ask you this because you're auction and grading. With the Pele cards, they're all hand cut, and I don't understand how you grade hand cut. Like I've seen I've seen a way more deviation or way more subjectivity in hand cut cards. Could you talk through that?
Yeah, and I think you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, for a lot of these issues that don't have clear guidelines, some of these hand cut cards they have at least borders that you can see, and you can, bazooka cards, you can see the dotted line where it's supposed to be, and as long as it's intact and showing, you can grade it accordingly. But for some of these that were just cut off the side of boxes or cut from panels or cut from magazines, it does get tougher, and there is a subjectivity to it. So I don't always agree myself with the way that some of these hand cut cards
totally subjective.
Yeah,
I mean, and Brian, you guys sell a 1969 Transagram Carl Yastrzemski. Right, I mean, you guys sell those all the time. A complete box version instead of cutting it on the lines. I mean, they've been doing these hand cut cards in baseball,
bazookas and post serials, and I mean, a lot of these are hand cut cards. So I tend to have an easier time explaining the ones that have the guidelines and the dotted lines and the borders on them, but the ones that don't, it's often greater interpretation.
So. Your 5 iconic cards. And these could be in your opinion, or these could be like the ones that you would want as eventually to own, or you might own all 5 probably. What are your 5 most iconic cards?
I have to lead off with the T206 Honus Wagner. I mean, that is a card that I just remember from my earliest days in the hobby as being, we talk about lore and mystique. I mean, that's got it going.
How did the dog bite off the corner of that card, the mystique? The Honus Wagner, the one that's like half bitten off, that one?
So he's talking about one of the more recent ones that sold that was only like half the card.
Yeah, I got you.
Not every card looks like that, though.
Yeah, there's about 60 of them known. So, yeah, there's, we sold one last 2021, 6.6 million. That was the record-setting price for a trading card until just recently. But that's a card that every time I see one, every time I handle one, I love. 52 Mantle. That was the first major vintage card that I bought when I had a couple bucks to spend on cards, because I know it's not his rookie. I know people frequently call it his rookie, but that's iconic. That's really the birth of Topps, and Topps we know today still. I think Babe Ruth, I don't know what Cage's favorite is, but he said it was 20 years after. I think 33 Gowdy Ruth is up there.
Which color?
I'm a big fan of the yellow background one. You know, I mean, they're all good. Wouldn't kick any of them out of my collection, but I love the yellow.
Green is your least favorite.
Yeah.
There's a hierarchy, man, and the other two kind of it's interchangeable.
Yeah, you could take
41, 49, 181 always is the one that people don't like.
You know, 86 Fleer Jordans in the conversation as well. It's hard to deny that card's place in the hobby. If you remove the pricing component from it right now and how it's gone from $20,000 to $800,000 to $200,000, if you just think about where it is in the hobby, where it represents basketball cards and where they've gone, and Jordan being the greatest, you know, I think that's in the conversation. And then, you know, the fifth and final one, you could go in a lot of different directions, but I think that, man, I want to make sure I get this right. I think the Jim Brown rookie card is probably my favorite football card. I think that that's just a very clean card. I think it epitomizes football. You know, he's right there in the center in this running position. So again, I think you need a list of 100 to hit them all.
T206 Wagner, 1952 Topps Mantle, 33 Gowdy, 86 Fleer, and then Jim Brown, 58.
Yep.
50. Pretty good, right?
Yeah.
So I have one more question.
Brian, we've spent time where he talks about how Mickey Mantle and Marilyn Monroe were married, because Mickey Mantle and Jordan Maggio are the same person to him.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm glad you got the 58 Brown. This is you're all grown up. I'm so excited.
You got a story to tell. You got a provenance. So I have one more question, but Cage, any final thoughts? Any final takes from you? I was going to ask about
it's almost
the jug
cage
slab
match.
arrow, but it doesn't affect you, Brian, because you guys do vintage.
So it's cage match time. I'll go easy on Brian, but it's a question that, if I were listening at home after hearing his story, cage wax would be good too. We should do that. The cage match. So I try to ask like a difficult question. I'm sure this won't be difficult for you, but you've seen ups and you've seen downs. And when you talked about tag grading, as for an example, it's like, oh well, they're trying to revolutionize an industry. They're trying to come in and kind of like change it and the whole deal. And when I worked at SGC, there weren't that many grading companies. And, when I started my own company with Sterling, there was nobody doing this. I think it's safe to say and fair of me to say this. There are no shortage of auction houses. Okay. So if I am a consumer, if I'm someone listening to this episode, I would ask, and I'd love your answer, why go to REA?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I mean, certainly Sterling in 2010 was this revolutionary idea, and it was like the fifth auction house on the scene, right? And now we've got dozens. The barriers to entry have really been broken down, and anybody can do it, so to speak. The thing that's always set REA apart is reputation, results, and level of service. And so if you're coming to us as a buyer, you're going to get great, authentic, verified material, high quality. What you see is what you get. You're going to have a wide selection. Certainly, we've broadened our offerings over the last 3 to 5 years. And if you're a seller, you can really count on REA to have the knowledge to present your items in the very best light. I cannot tell you how many times we've created value out of thin air from people by finding things they didn't know they had, or knowing how to grade a card, or knowing who to grade a card with, because that's always something that comes into the equation. But we're a company of collectors. You heard my story, right? I love these cards. My employees love these cards. We're going to handle every step of the process, whether you're a buyer or seller, with the very best level of service and knowledge, and all of that combines to turn in incredible results. So that's the REA difference, in my opinion.
Love it. I mean, listen, I've bid with you guys. I love that people, here's my lane. And I'm not saying, you're only going to get 1970 and before. I mean, one of the things I love about bidding with REA, and I share this with our audience, right? I'd love to hoard it all. But honestly, if you want, I mean, by the time you're hearing this, the last auction for REA has already happened. But it's got a nice, the Kobe Finest Gold, Andrew. The rookie one with the
right?
Yeah, the one where he's like doing like the little like. Pick up one of those. Those are in the auction. It's not vintage baseball, but you got a really nice Peyton Manning, the SPX rookie selling there. So I mean, I like to look where people aren't looking. I don't want to bid against 5,000 people. So sometimes, REA, I'm lurking in the weeds. I don't always get the bargains I think I'm going to get because I think you got a lot of eyeballs on it anyway.
Well, I was just saying, we got a lot of people that might maybe employ that same logic.
Yeah.
Got a bidding war going on. So
exactly,
we reach a lot of people, and we've got a wide variety. And so yes, we've cut our teeth on the pre-1970. But we've got a little bit of everything. I mean, you'll find Pokemon cards, you'll find non-sports cards, you'll find an Abraham Lincoln autograph in the right auction. I mean, we're all about just selling quality stuff that's gonna fit in, and we're building a spring auction right now that goes off in April. That's gonna have just incredible stuff. Some of it's never come to market in 20 years. So I'm very, very excited about that. And then we've got a February Encore auction coming up. So when this does air, we'll be about 2 weeks away from another monthly auction with 3,000 items in it. So there's always something around the corner.
You got time for one more tough question and one more easy question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, tough or easy first?
Your pick.
All right, tough always. I come to you. I own a Baltimore News, Babe Ruth. I say, hey, I just saw the valuation on collectibles, $8 million and change. Why should I go auction with you versus bringing it to Rally, bringing it to collectible? And what are your thoughts in general on fractional?
So I think fractionalization is a very interesting concept, actually. I mean, I've been following Rally for a number of years. Obviously, they got their start in things like cars and other collectibles outside of sports. I think it's great. I think it allows people to get in on items that they wouldn't otherwise afford. And I think as this price escalation has occurred and maybe continues, we'll see fractionalization really get some steam behind it in our world potentially. One of the important things, at least as it pertains to the Baltimore News Ruth, is that was a very small fraction of the overall card. And so, I don't know if there's the appetite for the volume of people that it would take to sell out a full offering on that. But I know I've got a list. We've sold more Baltimore News Ruths than anybody. So whenever you search for one online, if you want to buy one, if you want to learn about one, REA comes up first. So I've got a list of people that want to buy that, and I know they can write the check, and I know that they can afford it, and I know that they want it. So, on a card like that, I think knowing the buyer and knowing somebody who's going to pay up and getting that certainty, as opposed to going out and trying to sell 8 million shares at $1 or 800,000 shares at $10, I think that's very appealing to people.
Okay, here's the easy one. You New Yorkers, your fandom is very interesting to me. Are you a Buffalo Bills fan?
I'm not. So
sure. Yeah, makes sense.
I'm from New York is so large that I'm from the part that about 90 minutes from Giants Stadium and about 6 hours from the Bills. So I had no exposure to them growing up. Giants, Jets were always on in the house. Only really recently, when Bills Mafia has been taking over the world, have I even heard about the Bills.
So Giants fan.
I grew up in a Giants household. Frankly, football is probably. I watch the game.
Are you a baseball guy? Are you just a baseball guy through and through?
I don't even watch modern baseball until it gets to the World Series, believe it or not. So I am so enamored with the old stuff. I keep up with the new stuff because it's part of my job, and I've got people here that are very passionate about it. But baseball games are long, so I got two little kids. It's tough to carve out 4 hours to watch a game. But I love good competition, whatever the sport is. Grew up in a Mets household. Grew up in a Giants household. But now today, I kind of just like good competition. On another podcast, I'll tell you about my life working for Fox Sports in the NFL. That was another zig that my life turned.
I'm
Well,
surprised your
cliffhanger.
parents didn't name you Dwight. You're born in '86 in New York. You know, Daryl, Dwight, could have been Hojo, could have been, you know.
My dad was a Boston fan in the Bronx. So,
Oh, wow.
my dad was rooting for. We had his allegiances torn in the '86 World Series.
I mean, a Boston fan. Woo! In New York, in the Bronx. Forget about it.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
pretty
don't worry
crazy.
about it. In the Yankee Stadium, they didn't even show up to the last game because it was cold. So, Luca Nation, hope you enjoyed this episode. Brian, nice little cliffhanger there with Fox Sports. Now I'm curious. Enjoy this episode. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, guys.